al popolo italiano perché faccio pressione sul governo. Lo chiedo, Piera, aiutami. Per piacere, fai vedere le foto.
أنا الصحفي حسن الزيدي أحمل جواز سفر ألماني.
I think of you all and each of you every day.
I'm journalist in Libération. Please, help me.
Stop hiding behind the "I don't negotiate with terrorists" myth.
We, the British, are completely to blame, along with the Americans, for the situation in Iraq.
There was a knock at the door, and everybody froze. I've never forgot what that feeling was like, and I still get a kind of a sick feeling, down the back of my spine when I remember.
We were all blindfolded and chained. The guards were rough, fairly violent. Slapped us around, beat on us. They didn't torture me. They interrogated me.
My life was in danger. They made several attempts to get hold of me. I had to go into hiding for about 3 weeks, together with my wife and 3 children.
We were put in solitary, and we were allowed out for half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening. You're completely unaware if anyone in the outside world knows that you've been captured.
What they did was blindfold me and tie my hands. I was then led up a hillside, and we had no idea if they were just going to execute us in the desert.
There have been a few times when I said to myself, this could be it. And you go deep within yourself and say, I've had a pretty good life, I've had my work, and then you converse with your God, and you say, okay.
A newspaper news editor, he said, I have the telephone number of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I wrote a letter. Somebody typed it, and I faxed it to CPJ.
Can you just break down for, say, Asia, attacks on the press pages, for the 10-country summaries?
The Committee to Protect Journalists, located in New York City, receives dozens of calls each day regarding journalists in danger and handles hundreds of cases each year from around the world.
طيب احنا احتمال كمان نضطر نكلم وزارة الإعلام ونشوف ايه الأخبار هناك.
Oui, justement, je vous appelle, c'est à propos de...
Aparentemente en una entrevista que le dio a otro diario.
你知道最近他
Filtration internet в Китае.
Comme ça, on peut commencer à voir qui travaille, qui fait quoi, qui...
Fortæl dig eller opdater dig på, hvordan vi lancerer vores bog på...
When I was a journalist in Mexico, the CPJ, I frankly found it something of an annoyance because somehow somebody at CPJ got my fax number, and 3 times a day, some enormous fax would come spitting out of my fax machine that would go on for pages. The mandate of this organization, what we do, is very clear. We exist to ensure that journalists everywhere are able to do their job freely. And I'm talking about individual journalists who put their lives and liberty on the line to report the news. And we want to ensure that that flow of information continues and that they know that they have the support of colleagues around the world when governments respond with violence and pressure.
Just about 90% of all the journalists killed in the world are local journalists covering local stories who, for whatever reason, gets together the courage to go up against the powers that be and pays the ultimate price. He gets killed.
90 to 95% of the journalists that we defend are local correspondents working in their own countries. And as a foreigner, you are acutely aware of your dependence on local journalists and the risk that they take to allow you to do your work. You show up in some town, you don't really know what's going on. What are you going to do? You're going to seek out the local journalists. And, those journalists I knew were taking a risk in providing me with information and working with me, and the risk was fairly extraordinary. If you're reporting on the activities of the local drug cartels or human rights abuses committed by the military, and I was considerably less vulnerable, of course, because I was an international correspondent with accreditation.
Really keep it short and sweet. I mean, I don't want to send them 6 pages.
One of the things that makes international journalists safer is their visibility, and the fact that, if anything happens to them, it immediately becomes an international incident.
Shaking with rage.
Ultimately, what we strive to do is give the local journalist the same level of visibility that an international correspondent would have. The media is notified, the government is aware that there's an international outcry, and there's also simply collegial support for people around the world doing the same job that we do as journalists without the same level of protection.
Really quick investigation.
The defense of this influential person, oftentimes a police officer or senior government official, resorts to legal stalling tactics, which can attenuate a case for years and years and years, oftentimes, we believe, designed to break the will of the witnesses that have risked their lives and livelihoods to testify in these cases.
The second area of policy we're looking at.
CPJ is effective. And by God, it's satisfying to go someplace and talk to the prime minister or the president or the justice minister or the speaker of the house and say, you need to let these people free. You put them in jail because you want to shut them up. Well, you can't shut us up. We're going to be more trouble than they were. Sometimes that works.
It worked in the case of Alcibiades Gonzalez del Valle, a Paraguayan journalist who was visiting New York in 1980 when a warrant for his arrest was issued by his government. Although he faced certain imprisonment, Gonzalez decided to return to Paraguay to face the charges and have his voice heard. It was Gonzalez's case that led to the creation of the Committee to Protect Journalists.
This story came over the Reuters wire one afternoon, and I clipped it.
Lori Nadell was a 32-year-old news writer at CBS when Gonzalez's story caught her eye.
The story had merit, and I knew that it wasn't going to make the air. Human rights was not a popular subject at the time, but I thought perhaps a journalism magazine might be interested.
Lori Nadell wanted to write about this for the Columbia Journalism Review.
Michael Massing was the 28-year-old editor of the Columbia Journalism Review.
Alcibiades Gonzalez del Valle seemed to embody for us both the threat to journalists and then just this incredible, personal courage to want to go back and stand up to them. And in the course of this, we became concerned not just about the article, but about the man's safety, because Paraguay was the type of place where he could go back and disappear and never be heard from again. And so he went back, and in fact, he was arrested. So we decided to just call around and find a group that would be able to sort of track him, and if anything happened, to create a stink so that there would be a price to pay for the government down there. But when we called around, we found there really wasn't any group that was set up to do this type of thing. And so we took it upon ourselves to improvise, and we notified the New York Times and the Associated Press and the State Department, and there were a lot of articles written about it. And after a period of time, he was released. We were ecstatic. We suddenly thought, hey, maybe we hit on something. And so we began exploring the idea of setting up an organization. But how do you then build an organization that can move governments run by juntas and strongmen thousands of miles away? So we thought that the key thing to get some sort of traction and credibility is to set up a board. So we went to people who were well-known proponents of free expression, Victor Navasky and Anthony Lewis and Jane Kramer.
Coleman McCarthy from the Washington Post wrote a column, and it mentioned me as working for CBS News, and I was called into a vice president's office, and he basically said, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Am I going to get fired? Or is there something wrong?" I was really scared. He was very severe and stern, and he said, "Well, no, there's somebody here who's possibly interested in joining your organization. And, you know, but he wanted me to check you out first. And he said, so here's his name and his number, and it was Dan Rather.
They were having trouble paying the rent. They couldn't pay the rent. And so I asked her what it was, sort of holding my breath, saying, you know, I'm not Donald Trump. And she said, well, my recollection, she said, we've got to have $250. And so I breathed a sigh of relief and said, well, you know, tell me what you do. And she gave me the vision. She laid it out. She said, you've been a land correspondent for all these years, and you've traveled the world, and you know what these other journalists have to go through. You know, sometimes they're coerced, pressure is enormous, sometimes kidnapped, sometimes murder. You know, Dan. And they have no place to go for help. And that struck a chord with me, because it is true, having been a land correspondent for the better part of 20 years, I did know those things. I had seen those things, and like so many other journalists, had just pushed it out of my mind. But Laurie and Michael were thinking about it, and that impressed me. So I wrote her a check, I think, for $500.
The biggest catch we could get would be Walter Cronkite.
Dan kind of gave us the green light to approach Walter, and was able to send our request through a CBS interoffice envelope from my desk to Walter's. And he called me on the interoffice phone. This is Walter Cronkite. You know, my boss was standing over me going, Laurie, you have a call from Walter Cronkite. And everybody's standing, there's like, you know, 30 people in the newsroom, and it's a dead silence.
Once we had Walter Cronkite and those of the other people I mentioned, we were off and running. We had no money, but we had stationery. That was our most precious research, our stationery with the letterhead on it. And it's interesting how much you can do with a letterhead, you know. People don't realize it's sort of like a Wizard of Oz thing, that there might not be that much behind the curtain.
I've given everyone a copy of the very, very preliminary plan for 2011. It's extremely ambitious. What I wanted to do was to...
What began as two young people with a typewriter is today a global organization with a full-time staff of more than 25.
Last year, we had a journalist die in custody. We had one of our early IPFA winner who died as well.
Over the past 30 years, CPJ has sent more than 100 delegations to dozens of nations, investigating abuses and presenting evidence to top officials.
On the military abuses against journalists.
And publicizing the plight of journalists in their home countries.
Protection of journalists.
In our third quarter of the year, we'll be...
Regional program coordinators cover the world, including Africa, Asia, Europe and Central Asia, the Middle East, North America, and all of Latin America.
About the Internet Advocacy Plan. This is the first time that we've been able, at this stage of the year, to incorporate an Internet strategy into our planning.
In addition, CPJ now has an Internet Advocacy Program, specifically focused on protecting the growing number of online journalists.
This brings me to journalist assistance, where we are to focus on East Africa, where our biggest workload came from last year.
In 2001, the committee established its Journalist Assistance Program, which provides emergency and long-term aid to journalists in dire need.
Work with other organizations that are underground, and it was put together.
When I came here in 1998, you never knew what was going to be facing you. For example, one day we got a fax from a Sierra Leonean journalist named Arun Rashid Dean.
I started practicing journalism at a kind of advanced level when I joined the Sierra Leone Broadcasting Service in 1991. That was about the time that the war in Sierra Leone started. The rebel movement was fighting to overthrow the government of Sierra Leone, and they invited the rebel forces from the countryside to join forces with them. A lot of people were being killed. They launched what they called Operation No Living Thing. That was when they started, in a ferocious manner, attacking whatever they came across on their way back. People were being amputated. Freetown, the capital, was the only safe haven in the entire country. I was reporting on sports, but I also was reporting political developments, social developments.
And the bullet go inside here and stop in that way.
What we were doing was to airlift victims, particularly those who were being amputated, to the city. So I decided to lead a camera crew to the hospital. And then we started doing programs from the hospital, a weekly documentary on the siege. We'll go there, interview war victims, asking them who did what to them. And people were also able to see their family members who they may have thought may have died. They started seeing them, listening to the program. It was a popular program. But also the rebel forces were watching the program while they were in the bush. They were watching the programs and they didn't like what they were hearing from the victims because the victims were pointing fingers at them. So they made several attempts to get hold of me. So I had to go into hiding. That was when I really knew that they were after me. I remember 2 little boys came where I was hiding, and they said, a rebel leader got hold of us, and they told us to tell them where you're living. In fact, what happened was that they told us that if they failed to do that, they're going to kill them. And it became clear to me that I had to go. My life was in danger.
He sent this message to CPJ and explained briefly the situation. The program coordinator found out that he had a visa actually to come to the United States to cover the Special Olympics. Arun had been a sports reporter, but the country was consumed by civil war, so he got sent out to do other reporting, like, atrocities committed by the rebels in Sierra Leone. So we recommended that he come ahead on this visa to cover the Special Olympics.
Even though I was coming with a Special Olympic Games visa, I knew I was not going to cover the Special Olympic Games because the games were over already. I was escaping some trouble in my country. I was escaping death at the hands of the rebel forces. I spoke to the lady who was the Africa coordinator at the time, and she said, we're working on something to get you out of Freetown immediately. Do you still have your visa? I said, yes. Within a week and a half, 2 weeks, I was out of Sierra Leone.
And when he got here, we helped him find a lawyer who would take the case for no money, and that lawyer helped Arun get political asylum here.
I arranged with the help of CPJ to get my wife and children out of Freetown, and they joined me here. But the thought occurred to me that I would not be able to do what I'm being used to be doing. Reporting, going out, conducting those interviews. Oh, I used to love it. Conducting those interviews, doing all the sport reporting, I knew, that has come to an end,
From 1992 to 2011, 850 journalists have been killed while doing their jobs. Nearly 2/3 of them were murdered without any consequence for their killers.
Journalists are committed to the belief that a free and independent press is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. Why do journalists do it? Because we see it as a duty. We see it as a life's work. It's a calling. We do it because we think it matters.
Understand our surroundings, to know why things happen, to know why people do what they do, and to share that information with others. That is a basic human impulse. And it is such a powerful, powerful urge that governments have to expend enormous energy and creativity to suppress it. But as long as there's human society, there will be people who act on this urge and feel it so intensely that they will overcome whatever obstacles put in their path to do this.
There are journalists around the world who go to work every day, not knowing if they are going to be kidnapped or beaten or killed. And why do they do that? I've met journalists who've lost both legs to car bombs. I've met journalists whose every colleague has been in prison. I've met journalists who've been given 20-year sentences by their own government for telling the truth. Why do they do that? Because they know how important it is. You cannot have a free society without a free press. I believe that firmly. They believe it too.
CPJ means the Committee to Protect Journalists. But I think it goes far beyond that. It's about bringing a sense of security and responsibility to journalists. When journalists believe that there is a group out there, thousands of miles away, that cares about us in a very small, remote village, then there's that feeling that they have the responsibility, without fear, to go do what they're supposed to do, to bring the news to the public. That's what CPJ does. It makes journalists feel that they belong, that what they're doing is right. It urges them to think that they too have a responsibility not to be a sellout, not to cow into the threats of those who want to suppress them, not to give in, not to compromise.